here I am with my 3 pieces for the Walk the Plank pajamas. Doing a size 10 for my son. I'm doing just a cotton woven fabric from a video game he likes. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to fold one piece right sides together and sew down the inseam. I'm going to sew on my sewing machine with a regular straight stitch. I highly recommend sewing all your seams on a sewing machine versus serger if you're using a woven fabric. Sometimes you can get away with just serging it, and you'll be lucky enough that it won't come undone at all, your fabric won't fray. But a lot of times, woven fabrics, the weave isn't meant to have such a small seam allowance as a 1/4 of an inch. And if you cut your seam allowance down, even though it's serged, it will still unravel with only a 1/4 of an inch left. Flannel is really popular for pajama pants, for cozy, wintry ones, and that will unravel very easily because it's a looser weave usually. So I highly recommend taking the time to run it through your sewing machine first and then finishing off the edges either with a zigzag on your sewing machine or your serger. It's one little extra step, but especially walk the planks are so quick. Running your 3 seams through the serger as well and sewing machine as well, it still is such a quick thing, and it will mean that they won't unravel. So I always take the extra time to run through my sewing machine than my serger, unless it's like a costume that I don't think they will ever play dress up in or something. If you think it'll get washed and worn several times, it's definitely worth taking the time. So I'm going to run these through my serger real quick. And that just finishes off the seam. It'll make sure it doesn't ravel. I'm not going to trim my seam down. I might trim a tiny bit off. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the Walk the Planks. But I'm going to leave most of that seam allowance there. And it just gives it a stronger seam. The time right now and go ahead and serge around the bottom. I like to serge around the bottom of mine instead of double folding. You can double fold to keep it from unraveling, or you can do like me and finish the edges and only fold it up once. Whatever you prefer. I'm not trimming anything off here. Maybe a little bit of fuzzies. But I just want to finish this edge. Alright, so now that I have my 2 inseams sewn up, I'm going to take one of the legs and I'm going to turn it right sides out. There we go. Then I'm going to take my one that I just turned right sides out and I'm going to put it inside my other leg. this will put them right sides together. And I'm just going to grab some clips real quick. I'm going to pin or clip them here at the inseam that I just sewed. I mean, as you can see, it's already kind of starting to unravel, almost 1/4 of an inch right there. It's just another reason why you want to leave that bigger seam allowance. A lot of times after cutting fabric, it's a little compromised, meaning this edge isn't very tightly woven anymore now that I have cut it and handled it, especially that little curve. See if I can get it to focus. So if you can see, it's already unwoven a little bit right there and definitely looser. So leaving that bigger seam allowance really helps. And of course my double notches are at the back. And I like to stick a pin or mark the top in some way in the back, just so I know that that's the back. I'm about to trim this off so it won't be there to help me anymore. Now I'm just going to stitch the crotch curve. That's from the front center up through the crotch to the back center. Kind of looks like a U shape. This one gets even more wear and tear than your inseams, so it's even more important to make sure it's a really strong seam with those curves and all the wear and tear it gets. So make sure, a lot of people will even double stitch this on their sewing machine and finish off the edges. My kids seem to grow so fast they don't wear them quite enough and long enough that that's needed yet. But if you're making them for a kiddo or an adult pair that you think will wear them over and over and wash them a ton, you could stitch this again on your sewing machine and finish it off on the serger, just making sure it's extra, extra strong where it's going to get the most wear and tear. And now that I'm done sewing them up and everything, I'm just going to trim this off. As I finish that seam. Okay, so they really look like pants now. They do look like very, very large pants now. We get a lot of posts about this time saying they look really, really big. They are really big, but don't worry about it. They will fit great, loose and comfy as intended. So now I have my waistband elastic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make it into a circle, make sure it's not twisted. Then I'm going to pick a zigzag stitch and I'm going to make it really wide. And I'm going to make the stitch length pretty short. And I'm going to butt them up against each other and zigzag them together. This gives a nice, smooth seam. And since it's sewn to the pants 2 more times, you have such a strong seam there, it's never going to come undone. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mark the front. Then I'm going to grab 2 more pins and mark it in quarters. I'm using my stitch line as the back. And I'm going to do the same thing with my pants. I'm just going to mark my quarters. It already has a front and a back seam. Here's my back that I marked earlier with that pin. So I'm just going to line up these 2 seams to find the quarter point on both sides. There we go. I'm just going to line up all of these markings, and I'm going to pin my waistband elastic to my pants. Elastic to wrong side. This leaves your exposed seam on the inside, but it's quick and easy, and that's how I prefer. We do show how you can hide that seam. If you do this step to the right side, and then you'll end up folding it in a little bit differently, it will hide that seam if that's something that bothers you. All right, so as you can see, my waistband is much smaller than mine. I cut out a size 10 and I use the size 7 elastic because my son is super thin. And so I'm going to be stretching my elastic a lot more than what most people will be. But that's okay. All I'm going to do is attach it to the pants. Now, you can use your serger for this, or you can use your sewing machine. I'm going to use my sewing machine because I feel like it's a little bit easier to see what I'm doing on the camera. So I am just going to use a long basting stitch, or you can just use a regular stitch. It doesn't really matter. I usually do use my serger for this, and actually, you know what? I'm going to do a zigzag because that will finish off my top of, what am I trying? It'll finish off this fabric right here, my top edge. That's why I usually use a serger. It kind of does both things at once. But either way, since I'm stretching this elastic, I'm going to have to put some pressure on the back of the fabric as well that's coming out of the sewing machine so that it can pull through nice and naturally. If you just pull the front, the sewing machine's not going to be able to pull the fabric through. So I just pull it until it meets my fabric, and then put a little bit of pressure on the fabric that's already come out of the sewing machine so that the feed dogs can push the fabric through. This is probably the trickiest part of these pants. If you're having a ton of trouble stretching the elastic and sewing and feeding it through, then you can always make a casing and feed your elastic through instead. I like doing it this way because it's quicker and easier for me. It's definitely a lot quicker. You don't have to go to your iron to create the casing. But when I was a beginner sewer, this was difficult for me. I felt like I needed an extra arm to do all the things that I needed to do. So if you are struggling with it, it's no big deal. You can just fold down your waistband length and give it a stitch, and then feed your elastic through with a casing method. Okay, so my top of my fabric is now finished off with a zigzag and my elastic is attached. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to fold it under, which I'm also going to stick a tag in for my son. The welted planks are pretty hard to tell the front from the back if you don't put a tag in. So let me grab one real quick. Grabbed this little cutie here. And what you're going to do is you're just going to fold down your fabric and pin. If you're using a sewing machine, you can pin from either side, whichever side you want to stitch from. If I'm using a sewing machine, I must always stitch from the inside, just like this. If I'm using a cover stitch machine, then I will sew from the outside and I'll pin from the outside. Okay, so when you fold down, you just kind of want to match your seam line up, make sure you're folding it nice and straight. Other than the front and the back, you don't have much to go on to make sure you're doing it straight. But if you have like a picture, stripes, whatever you can to make sure you're doing your best to fold it straight. What I usually do is the front and the back, and then I kind of go to where I feel about the middle of the side is, and then I go in between those, and I did it from the outside instead of the inside from habit. Switch those real quick. I usually use my cover stitch machine. I almost always make these in knit for my kids because they prefer the feel of knit pajamas versus woven pajamas. But my son is a big fan of this video game, and we found this fabric, and that was that. So for those wondering, I grabbed this fabric from my local Walmart, actually. When you're folding over and pinning, you want to make sure that you don't have any extra fabric up here. If you do, when you sew it down, it's going to bubble like that. You're not going to like the way that looks. So make sure when you're folding it, it's nice and flat around the elastic. Okay, I think about one more pin and then I'll be good. Depending on what size you're making will determine about how many pins you're going to need. I'm going to sew with the same zigzag. You can sew with a straight stitch. This woven fabric is not going to stretch any more than it is, even with the elastic. It's only going to go back to its normal length. But I kind of like the look of the zigzag. And it will finish off this edge one more time. So just like you did before, you're going to have to stretch the elastic as you sew. So I'm just grabbing at this pin, stretching until my fabric is flat. And I'm putting a little pressure on the back since I am pulling on the front, so that it feeds through nice and smoothly. Again, you want to make sure that you don't have a ton of extra fabric on here, on the top. So sometimes you can get a little fabric bubbling at the top here. You just want to kind of smooth it down here and make sure it's nice and flat with your elastic. As you're stitching, you want to make sure it's all just nice and flat everywhere. Make sure you're not pulling your fabric through, even though you are applying pressure back there. You still want to let the feed dogs pull the fabric through nice and evenly. If you're having a hard time stretching and pulling and getting everything even, the more pins you use, the better. Because then you only have to go from pin to pin, and the smaller that length is, the easier it is to control everything. So where I just put in about 8 pins, you could put in closer to 12, 16, until you're comfortable going between pins. I really love this method. It means that the elastic isn't going anywhere. It's not flipping around. If you do a casing, sometimes you either have to stitch in the ditch or it can flip around on you. And it's quick. Here we go. Still have some threads to trim. And then the last thing is hemming. This is the one time you gotta get up and go to the iron. You're just gonna fold it under 1 inch, just like that. And you know what, I'll just go ahead and stitch these. They're pajama pants, so if I don't iron, I think he'll be okay. I'm just going to do a straight stitch here. Again, I like to sew from the inside if I'm just using my sewing machine. I finished off the edge and I'm just folding up 1 inch. If you did not finish off the edge, you'll want to double fold so that you're hiding that raw edge. There we go, just like that. So if I did not finish off this edge, what you'd want to do is fold 1/2 inch and another 1/2 inch. Like that. I like the deeper hem, so that's why I finish it off and just fold once. And done. That's how quick and easy these are. Just inseams, crotch seam, throw in the elastic and hem them up, and you're done. My son is gonna love these, and they're gonna be loose and comfortable and hopefully fit him for a little while. Don't forget to share yours once you're all done. We love to see your makes.